the all right, let me share my screen. Can everyone see this?
Yeah.
Okay, so we started our course in mysticism last week, attempting to drive at a definition of what is mysticism. And we had several quotations from the Baha'i writings, from other thinkers, some proposed definitions. I want to continue on that theme this time, and start with the idea that that I didn't mention explicitly last time, that might have been in some people's minds in defining mysticism. For some, the definition of mysticism is simply the experience of God. The idea that somehow it is a possible mode of consciousness for human beings to have the direct experience of the divine, and that's simply what mysticism is being in the presence of God. And this begs the question, though, what do we mean by God? And we can't get too far into the subject of mysticism before we deal with the concept of God and what is God? What kind of a reality is God? And here we are necessarily embedded in and all raised in a culture, particularly in the West, whether it's in the Near East or the West, suffused with monotheism and monotheistic conceptions of the divine, in which God is a transcendent being. And of course, everyone will quickly say, of course, God doesn't have a white beard like is depicted in all these Renaissance paintings, but you can't get that image out of your head. And even if you think you can successfully get the image of God in the white beard, painting images in the sky out of your head, you still can't get out of your head fundamentally this conception of God as being some sort of transcendent being or entity who stands outside of space and time, who created the universe at some moment, who has an ongoing interest in the operations of the universe, who has a particular interest in human beings and our relationship with God, who listens to us, with whom we have a personal relationship, from whom we ask things, to whom we may be granted or may not be granted favors and answers to prayers and so forth, and who acts in history through the direct interposition of his will at various moments. These moments perhaps being miraculous, the parting of seas, the curing of diseases, the raising of the dead, and so forth. Or perhaps in maybe more modern theologies, in more invisible ways, maybe not quite so dramatic and spectacular ways, but still fundamentally in ways which represent a suspension of the normal operation of the laws of nature, so that the will of God can be affected. That I suppose is my attempt to sum up what many of us may have in mind when we think about God. And of course, this idea of God as a being, which exists, is really just a slight simplification from the ideas that people in the not too distant past have had about multiple gods, pantheons of gods, which were the norm in human history up until the emergence of monotheism in just a few thousand years ago. But whether we're talking about the existence of many gods or a single God, so long as we think about God in the category of a being, a transcendent entity, the question will naturally arise, well, do these beings exist? Does this being exist? Can we prove that this God exists or not, given that this God is essentially invisible, and if and when he chooses to act in the world in a miraculous manner, those moments can't be predicted in such a way that we can stand around and be there to catch the miracle, to sort of so that our proof is there. So we're left with other means to try to convince ourselves of the existence of such a transcendent being. And I don't want this, there's no point for this course to get too deeply into the weeds as to the history of logical proofs of the existence of God, but it's worth noting that traditionally there are three major categories of such proofs that are actually found in the philosophical literature going back to the ancient Greeks, but which is found also in the Baha'i writings themselves. Various versions of these proofs are found in the Baha'i writings. So for example, the cosmological proof, which is perhaps the oldest and most famous, explained by Aristotle back a few hundred BC, is the idea that everything that exists has an explanation. There's a cause for everything, and those causes have their causes. And so there's a chain of causes going back in time. And the little logical piece that you have to add in is the idea of an infinite series of causes is somehow illogical or impossible. And so therefore there must be some origin to all of the causes. There must be some unmoved mover. And that presumably is God. And there are arguments, variations of this argument have been expressed throughout history, and quite a number of possible refutations of that argument as well. Similarly with the ontological argument, which is a little bit of, I think, of more modern construction, and that can be summed up as proving the existence of God from the very concept itself, that somehow God's existence is intrinsic to the definition of God. In other words, if God is that being greater than which nothing can be conceived, then if such a God did not exist, it would be possible to conceive something greater. But since God is that being greater than which nothing can be conceived, then that being must necessarily exist. Otherwise, it would be possible to imagine a greater being. So therefore, God exists. And for many, this ontological, for many, I think more philosophically oriented people, this is a very convincing proof of the existence of God. However, there are refutations of this proof as well. I suppose you could define the perfect unicorn as that unicorn greater than which nothing could be conceived, and which must necessarily exist. Otherwise, if it didn't exist, you could imagine a greater unicorn. So why would you limit such an idea to God? Why wouldn't you just multiply that logic all the way out? So the cosmological, the ontological, and the teleological being the third family of proofs for God's existence. And this also is of, I think there's a modern formulation of it attributed to William Paley from a few hundred years ago. And he said, imagine you're walking out in the forest and you come upon a watch, a pocket watch lying on the ground, on the forest floor. And could it be imagined that pocket watch just happened to appear there? Or would you necessarily deduce that there must have been a watchmaker who made that watch and then dropped it on the forest floor, because watches just don't appear? And the watchmaker argument has been applied to life on Earth. The beauty and complexity of life on Earth, of our natural surroundings seem just fantastically designed to the smallest detail. Isn't it the case, you know, is it not the case that there's some grand designer that's behind this design? The watchmaker argument was dealt, in the eyes of many, a fatal blow by by Darwin's theory of natural selection, which as we all know, gave a plausible explanation for the appearance of apparently designed creatures with all of their complexity. So on the matter of all these logical proofs, however, it seems that those who want to be convinced by these proofs will find them convincing. And those who enter into the topic of logical proofs with a degree of skepticism will rarely find themselves convinced by the proofs. So they seem to only be useful for those for whom there is already maybe a predisposition to have some kind of a belief in God. It seems for most people, what convinces them of the existence of God is something beyond these logical proofs. And if you look at the Baha'i writings themselves, and this is the slide that has the most number of words on it, so I apologize for the too long quotations, but I felt like it was important to show you these two quotations, because this is going to open up what I feel is a key point in this whole series of lessons that we'll be going through. And that is that one can often find two starkly opposing points of view about apparently fundamental matters of reality within the Baha'i writings themselves, but beyond as well. And when it comes to something so fundamental, we would imagine, as does God exist? Can God's existence be proven? We find within the Baha'i writings themselves completely opposite statements about the possibility of a logical proof for God's existence. So, for example, in the writings of Abdu'l-Baha, he says, in the context of one of his tablets, that the existence of the divine being hath been clearly established on the basis of logical proofs, but the reality of the Godhead is beyond the grasp of the mind. The furthermost limits of this bird of clay are these: he can flutter along for some short distance into the endless vast, but he can never soar upward to the sun in the high heavens. We must nevertheless set forth reasoned or inspired proofs as to the existence of the divine being, that is, proofs commensurate with the understanding of man. There are many such proofs establishing the existence of that universal reality. And the entirety of this tablet is Abdu'l-Baha then laying out several such proofs and summarizing, say, the cosmological argument and the teleological argument, and a version of the ontological argument. Elsewhere, also, Abdu'l-Baha talks about these proofs, says there are many of them, they're incontrovertible, but the Bab, a number of decades earlier, seems to be saying something entirely different. So what does the Bab say? This is quoted in Nader Saidi's book, Gate of the Heart. It says, "Know thou, O seeker, that in the books they have penned, the philosophers have brought forth arguments for the existence of a fashioner, even as the mystics have adduced proofs for his unity. But these books are all refuted by the testimony of the very proofs they contain, inasmuch as the latter are all contingent, and it is impossible for the proof of the divine essence to be contingent. Nay, rather, should anyone fix his gaze upon the point of truth, pierce the veils and unravel the illusions, he would know of a certainty that to provide any argument for the existence of the incomparable one, or any proof for his unity other than God's own description, is a cardinal sin and a most grievous transgression. So is Abdu'l-Baha committing a cardinal sin in the eyes of the Bab by producing these proofs for God's existence? Or is there something else going on? And so I offer these two proofs sort of side by side to invite us into thinking about these deepest of theological subjects and topics about reality as things that have multiple points of view that can be simultaneously valid. And in doing so, I'm aware of how such a perspective can be abused. And so I will open up by acknowledging the danger of overstating the case that, well, every point of view can be justified. To say that ultimately there is no truth at all, and that any points of view can be reconciled with each other, I think is to go too far. I think it might be closer to say that the structure of reality as it presents itself to us admits of a certain number of, but not an infinite number, of equivalent ways of describing reality. So to give an example that everyone's heard of at one point or another, in the theory of quantum mechanics, you can set up a description of fundamental particles which treat them as particles, in which they are measured as particles and conceived as particles. You can also set up a description of those particles or experiments on those fundamental particles in which they're actually not, don't behave as particles, but rather as waves. It's not that there's some third or fourth or fifth or infinite number of ways of describing fundamental particles. It's not that any theory goes. It's rather that there seems to be a duality. There seems to be a, somehow at the root of reality, there seems to be a two different perspectives within which one can describe fundamental things. And when it comes to ideas about divinity, one can see these dualities existing in a couple of different ways. And the first one is where and how one locates the ultimate reality that one calls God. One can think about God as a transcendent being existing outside space and time, as we talked about, which then of course begs the question, well, does such a being exist? If so, what's the mode of interaction that may being have with the world as we observe it? And that way of thinking about God as transcendent is contrasted historically with another way of looking at God, which is not out there, but within. Not transcendent, but immanent. And immanent is something which is a part of our own deepest reality. And this idea of the immanent God, which very much complements and contrasts the idea of the transcendent God, is what we find in the hidden words of Baha'u'llah. There's a sequence of 3 hidden words in the Arabic, where Baha'u'llah says, "Thou art my lamp and my light is in thee. With the hands of power I made thee, and with the fingers of strength I created thee. And within thee have I placed the essence of my light. And turn thy sight unto thyself, that thou mayest find me standing within thee, mighty, powerful, and self-subsisting." So this sort of God that exists within the heart, one doesn't find the need to prove its existence logically in the same way if it is something which is the inmost reality of the heart, something which is already present, and something which is intimately a part of, rather than something which is invisibly outside of. Thus, this bifurcation, this division between the transcendent and the immanent God has, I think, another manifestation in what we might call positive and negative theology. Positive theology is exactly what we were talking about before, the theology of a God who actually exists and whose existence can be rationally proven, who has certain attributes, who acts in the world, and so forth. And this idea of the existing God has also been contrasted, not identically with the idea of the immanent God, but it I think lines up with it in some way, but it's not the identical idea, with the God who can best be described as having no attributes. In a way, it's taking the idea of God's greatness to the extreme and saying, God is so great that no attribute does justice. And so therefore we must negate all attributes and deny all attributes in order to do justice to the true position of the divine being, which is that it's beyond any attribute that we can conceive. One of the most famous expositors of this idea of negative theology was a Christian whose name is unknown, and so the scholars have named him Pseudo Dionysius because he went under the name of he was erroneously thought to be the same as someone else called Dionysius. So now he's known as Pseudo Dionysius, lived around 5th or 6th century AD. And he wrote a famous book called Mystical Theology and the Divine Names. And a couple of statements from there sum up this idea of negative theology, that godlike minds can find no more fitting method to celebrate its praises than to deny it every manner of attribute. And also, even the title of goodness, we do not ascribe to it because we think such a name suitable, but desiring to frame some conception and language about this, its ineffable nature, we consecrate as primarily belonging to it the name we most revere. In other words, we say it's good just because that's the best word we have, not because it really attaches to the divine reality. And in this too, we shall be in agreement with the sacred writers. Nevertheless, the actual truth must still be far beyond us. Hence, we have given our preference to the negative method, because this lifts the soul above all things cognate with its finite nature. This negative method is found, although I've given Pseudo Dionysius as a exemplar of it, it goes back farther, even to Plotinus in a couple of centuries before. And it's found very strongly as well in the Baha'i writings, where Baha'u'llah talks about God being beyond all names and attributes. There's a statement in the long obligatory prayer that I testify that thou hast been exalted above all names, transcendent above all attributes. The idea of negative theology taken to its logical conclusion leads one to the conclusion that, and this will sound like a crazy statement, but in the context of negative theology, it makes sense, lead one to say things like God doesn't exist, because to exist is an attribute of this world. It's something that if something exists or not, then it's within the typically it's within, say, the means of science to uncover whether it exists or not. There'll be some physical sign of its existence. But this God of negative theology, one does not even talk about its existence. It's beyond all of that. So all of this is this sort of showing opposites and showing you when we talk about God, we get into these irresolvable conundra. We get into logical proofs that aren't really proving what they say they're proving. We get into statements in the Baha'i writings where, say, the Bab says outright that that's a form of idolatry to even attempt it. We have these contrasting ways of conceptualizing the divine as either being something very intimately within or something very transcendently without, or something that's full of all of the attributes that we can imagine, or something that that is absent all of those attributes. They're completely contrasting ways of understanding. And I would say that this concept of God is only one of many such ideas in which when one drills into it, one finds kind of polar opposites. And we will find more of these as we move through the subject matter. The Baha'is during the time of Shoghi Effendi would write to Shoghi Effendi about this, and complain to Shoghi Effendi, saying, "I'm finding this says this in the writings here, and it says the opposite thing here, and what's going on? Is there an internal contradiction?" And in a number of letters written on Shoghi Effendi's behalf, he would say things like, "You should think of the writings as a sphere. There are points on opposite poles, and in between are the thoughts and doctrines that unite them." And the idea of a sphere is, I think, particularly useful in imagining how it can be that you can have these polar opposites that nevertheless all can sit comfortably with each other. With a sphere, say the sphere of the moon, you can only ever see one hemisphere at a time. And actually the only hemisphere of the moon that we've seen, unless you've gotten in a rocket ship and flown to the other side, you only ever see one half of the moon. And if you were to try to map the entirety of the moon on one piece of paper, you couldn't do it without wildly distorting the other half of the moon. We're all familiar with the Mercator projection of the Earth, which manages to get some representation of the surface of this three-dimensional body in 2 dimensions, but it does it at a great cost. It has to cut the map at some arbitrary point, which distorts our understanding of the relationships between things. And then it also has to stretch things at the poles so wildly out of proportion that one also often comes away with a very distorted idea of the actual size of land masses towards either pole. And so there's a way of projecting higher dimensional realities onto 2 dimensions, but it comes at a cost. Some information is lost. And I think that's a great analogy for these kinds of topics that we're talking about, where you have a logically provable God, which Abdu'l-Baha seems to say over and over in his talks to friends in the West. And then you have the Bab outright saying such a thing is not possible. It's as though we're looking at 2 different sides of the sphere, 2 different, fundamentally different ways of knowing and different ways of approaching a subject. And I'll say parenthetically that Abdu'l-Baha in later years was asked about some answer questions, which he said was he said some answer questions was for the Westerners. He said, for the Easterners, we have the Faraid of Abu Faz. So even Abdu'l Baha in later years would contextualized even the content of Some Answered Questions as being something which was, let's say, cast through a particular lens, a particular like European lens, and made use of categories of thought which were familiar to his interlocutor, to Laura Clifford Barney, which seemed very Aristotelian in their conception, always dividing things up into this and that. You know, that's oftentimes in answering a question, Some Answered Questions, Abdu'l Baha would say, well, there are two kinds of this. And he would go on and explain the two kinds of whatever it is that he was being asked about. And that's a particular way of thinking, which one can say with, I guess at some risk of overgeneralizing, but I think overall true, a particular way of thinking which the Western mind has really perfected, which is a way which one might call utilizing the eye of distinction. That is, looking at the world and understanding the world by dividing it up into its parts. And one could say that the scientific method is this idea and this posture of being towards one's reality and towards one's environment. You know, it is the sort of the highest expression of that is the scientific method that divides up matter into its component parts and then divides those up into their components and those up into their components until we have the most complex and powerful scientific machines ever built by the human race are those which explode atoms into the tiniest fragments to get at the subcomponents of to try to isolate those smallest components as a way of understanding the ultimate makeup of matter. And this has been extraordinarily successful. And it has led to incredible insights about the nature of the physical world. And it's led to the emergence of amazing technologies, which have completely transformed human life in most ways for the better. But this way of looking at the world, which is one might say through the eye of distinction, is contrasted almost like the other side, the other hemisphere, a whole different world of thought, a whole different world of seeing by what one might call the eye of unity. Seeing the world and all its differences and understanding it by looking at the commonalities behind the apparently separate things that one is seeing. And this eye of unity is fundamentally, or let's say largely, the province of the mystical path. So when we think about our everyday experience in the world, it's the experience of separate things, all assailing our senses from moment to moment. The objects that we deal with, obviously the people that we interact with, everything is experienced as separate and understood as separate realities. And obviously, it's a very useful way and a very pragmatic way of navigating our world, without which one could not navigate. But there is another way of looking at the world which tries to look at the unity underlying the realm of multifarious appearances, and to come at a deeper understanding of that world by way of seeing the things that are in common. And although I've identified one more with the method of the scientist and more of the kind of, let's say, spirit of Western civilization writ large, and the other is more aligned with the way of the mystic, and it's also perhaps more in the spirit the philosophy and civilizations of the Far East, seeing the world from the perspective of oneness. To say that is obviously to make great generalizations which are not true, for which one can find infinite number of counterexamples. But I think it's still useful to lay it out there as sort of two major roads that human civilization has trodden, and both of which have been fruitful in their own way. On the topic of this idea of the eye of unity, and I'll just be introducing it in this session, and we'll be going in more depth into it in the next session or sessions. One can find a number of statements in the Baha'i writings that seem to affirm this idea of the underlying or intrinsic oneness of everything. Of course, without going any further, we can state that the core Baha'i principle of the oneness of the human race is an outgrowth or a natural expression of that, of seeing through the eye of unity as opposed to seeing through the eye of division and distinction, which would lead to, say, seeing individuals as fundamentally in conflict, or gathered into tribes which are fundamentally in conflict, or nations or religions or what have you. But through this universalizing eye of unity, it provides the foundation for the true embrace of the oneness of the human race. But it goes beyond that to extend over all phenomena of creation. So in one of Baha'u'llah's tablets, for example, he says, there is but one reality and one essence that is expounded in the worlds of outer form, and at each of its stages is described by a specific name, in accordance with the degrees of its particular manifestations on the plane of this limited world. So it's as though the names that we name things, from the most fundamental level, that's a proton, that's an electron, or that's a molecule of water or a molecule of carbon. The names that we give things ultimately are relatively true and valid within a particular way of looking, but there is a deeper layer of understanding within which every name that we assign ultimately dissolves. There's a perspective in which the diversity of names is replaced, and one sees this this unity of essence that underlies all things. What is that unity of essence? Abdu'l-Baha talks about it in one of his talks in the West. He says, I will speak to you upon the intrinsic oneness of the world of all phenomena. This is one of the abstruse subjects of divine philosophy. As each component atom or element in the physical organism of existence is subject to transference through endless forms and stages, possessing virtues peculiar to those forms and stations, it is evident that all phenomena of material being are fundamentally one. The origin of all material life is one, and its termination likewise one. This is an idea that underlies Abdu'l-Baha's description of what one might call the circle of existence, which is introduced in one of the later chapters of Some Answer Questions, which everything emanates from the one and everything returns to the one in ascending and descending arcs, is a particularly rich and useful way of understanding the spiritual perspective, not just of the Baha'i faith, but I think of many traditions that share the same mystical core. That ultimately there's a unifying source behind all things, which is at the same time the end of all things. In relation to the principle of the oneness of humanity, Abdu'l-Baha says in Paris Talks, he says, your souls are as waves on the sea of the spirit. Although each individual is a distinct wave, the ocean is one, and all are united in God. Every heart should radiate unity, so that the light of the one divine source of all may shine forth bright and luminous. We must not consider the separate waves alone, but the entire sea. We should rise from the individual to the whole. The spirit is as one great ocean, and the waves thereof are the souls of men. Elsewhere, this great ocean of which our souls are the waves is described as the primal will of God. The primal will, which is the same as the word of God described in the Gospel of John in the Bible. This is an idea which has corresponding instances in many other traditions. In the first Gospel of John, it said, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So there's the idea in the Gospel of John of this primordial existence, which is in some way identical with God, but in some way not. That somehow becomes material, that becomes flesh. Of course, in the beings, the bodies of all created things, but also specifically in the context of the Gospel of John, in the temples of the prophets. But this idea of our spirits ultimately being waves on a sea is one way of understanding our ultimate, the identity of our ultimate essence. And it's one way of understanding Baha'u'llah's statements in the Hidden Words, where he uses there the analogy of the spark, the divine spark which is within us. Here it's more using the analogy of water, that we're all drops or waves on this great ocean of spirit. The implication, of course, being that the wave ultimately returns to the sea, and that but the sea is ever generating new waves. These mystical ideas of oneness behind all things, of course, seem extremely counterintuitive, because the world that we navigate on a day-to-day basis is a world of separate things. It's a world of distinctions, which we have to keep in mind and which we have to navigate through. But if one is able to traverse this world with an appreciation for the kinds of deeper onenesses that lie underneath it, it has pragmatic, very practical consequences that affect us meaningfully, both individually and collectively. First of all, as we've already alluded to, it's a real foundation for the principle of the oneness of humanity, and leads us naturally to a care for, a concern for, and a love for our neighbor. And not just our neighbor, those closest to us, but those who are farthest from us on opposite parts of the world, because we recognize our unity in that divine spark, or put in other words of the other metaphor, we recognize that we're all made of that same water, the same spiritual ocean that we're all waves of. Another practical consequence is that when we understand this unity underlying all things, we also understand the intimate and organic interconnectedness that bind all things together, not just human beings in the form of a society, in form of tribes and nations and civilizations, but all physical things. And this leads to naturally also to an understanding and concern for our environment, which we are increasingly aware of is one of the great existential concerns of the human race today. Understanding that our environment and the resources within it are of finite extent, and that our human growth and progress has in our lifetimes finally visibly reaching the edges and the limits of that finite extent. And we're starting to see the direct impact of human activity in the climate of our planet. And unless we have some deeper sense of our interconnectedness with everything else, what could motivate us to act other than in our own limited self-interest? If we didn't have some sense that our ultimate and deepest reality is the same as the reality of everything around us, what would give us that sense of care that is a prerequisite for dealing with this existential problem? And finally, another practical consequence is our own individual selves, understanding where we came from, what our true reality is also, and this is really where other faith traditions such as Buddhism have this immense outpouring of spiritual technologies, of meditation and practice around identifying the root causes of human suffering and eliminating that suffering by this understanding and perception of this underlying oneness, which has as the opposite pole of it an understanding of the ephemerality of the human ego, of what we take to be our eternal selves. In the larger scheme of things, the drop returns to the ocean. But we'll be coming back to that point in later sessions. So that's about all of the content I wanted to present this time. And this is going to lead us naturally on this theme of oneness and differentiating between the eye of oneness and the eye of distinction in relationship to the nature of the human soul and the stages of the spiritual path. So we'll be looking at particularly, of course, focusing on Baha'i writings about the nature of the soul, and also looking at the stages in the mystical path as Baha'u'llah describes them in the Seven Valleys and in other mystical writings. And so we're going to come back to this eye of distinction and eye of unity. We're going to see it manifesting in different ways, very much in Baha'u'llah's and Abdu'l-Baha's writings in the weeks to come. So thanks for listening up to this point. I'll stop the sharing and open it up to questions and reactions.
I will go ahead and ask the first question. So I have some sort of question / comments about the logical proofs that you presented. So to me, it was a little bit confusing because I was expecting to see a definition and then followed by a proof of existence. But what I learned was there were different definitions of God. And so I felt like maybe I missed something. So can you elaborate more on that? So for example, there was this, the unmoved mover. Mm-hmm. So that seemed to me like a definition of God. Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is the definition. Or there was another one, the root cause of everything. Well, that was the one. Anyway, so I'm trying to understand this better, whether those were actual logical proofs or more like logical definitions. I don't know. Does it make sense?
Yeah. No, it should be confusing because God is one of those ideas which, when you drill down to it, it's like it escapes your grasp. I mean, when you try to define God as a being, an existing being that exists outside of space and time invisibly, that nevertheless created the universe, then one is led to down the path of, okay, well then we can prove whether it exists or not, because it's a real thing and it's out there somewhere. We just need to prove that it exists. And so there's this huge tradition of human thought among philosophers and theologians to try to formulate proofs that would demonstrate the existence of such a being. But what I tried to sort of show in my presentation is that although there is, I wanted to give a taste of some of the proofs that have been offered for the existence of such a definition of God, there are, not only have those proofs not been that convincing to those who don't walk in already wanting to be convinced. In other words, none of these proofs are considered to be final. I mean, there's an open debate on any one of these categories of proof throughout the whole history of their existence. And so not only is there nothing final and conclusive about the proofs themselves, but there are these other conceptions of the divine that we see in history in different cultures, and even in within Western culture. The idea, for instance, of God being something within as opposed to something that's out there somewhere, or God being something which is beyond attributes at all, rather than something which is characterized by positive attributes. And if you're going to conceive of the divine being as beyond all attributes, then there's no point of proofs. I mean, proofs then become something which are maybe for children, maybe for those who need them. There's an early chapter of Some Answered Questions where Abdu'l-Baha gives a few proofs. I think this is at the end of chapter 2. He gives a few proofs, and then at the end he says, I've offered these proofs for the weak-minded. And so he he himself it's like, well, what does Abdu'l-Baha think about these proofs? Does he treat them seriously or not? Because there's so many tablets and talks where he seems to treat them perfectly seriously and say, look, here are the proofs for God's existence. But here in Some Answered Questions, after giving a few of them, he goes, yeah, these are for the weak-minded. So what's going on here? And what I'm trying to suggest is that there are different languages. There are different languages for understanding these kinds of subjects, like the existence of God, which are all valid within their frame of reference, because people come in all shapes and sizes and all frames of reference. And I was actually going to quote this, and somehow it didn't end up getting quoted. Oh, here it is. Oh, so I missed a slide. Okay. This might help tie things together a little bit. So this is kind of key to what I wanted to suggest this session. Why are all these different conceptual languages for understanding something as fundamental as God? Like, why couldn't we just nail it down and say, well, given that this is such a central idea, we can narrow down to the right way to think about it. And I think we'll find that there is no single right way to think about it. There is no end of the path where we decide this is the correct idea and that's not the correct idea. And I have two quotations here from many more that I'll be bringing out in the weeks to come. So Abdu'l-Baha says in one of his tablets, he says, the differences among the religions of the world are due to the varying types of minds. That's such an interesting idea, because minds are different, and that's like an intrinsic feature of the world, right? I mean, it's not like we want to get to a point where all minds are the same. And maybe there are certain kinds of minds raised in certain kinds of cultures which will tend to think about God as a being that can be proven. And that's okay. And for that, you have some answered questions. And maybe there's other kinds of minds or other kinds of cultures, other ways of seeing, for which the whole idea of a logical proof is at best a childish pastime or something which is nonsensical to start with. And here you have the Bab, who says, you know, the whole idea of trying to prove it is somehow is almost blasphemous. So here's what Baha'u'llah says about this intrinsic degree of difference of opinions that somehow we're going to have to work within, and somehow topics like mysticism or topics like God and so forth are all going to have to work within a sort of fundamental state of differentiation between different minds, between different perceptions. So here's Baha'u'llah in a newly translated tablet, in mystical tablet, and called The Divine Beloved. He said, since all do not possess the same degree of spiritual understanding, certain statements will inevitably be made, and there shall arise as a consequence as many differing opinions as there are human minds, and as many divergent beliefs as there are created things. This is certain and settled and can in no wise be averted. Our aim is that thou shouldst urge all the believers to show forth kindness and mercy, and to overlook certain shortcomings among them, that differences may be dispelled, true harmony be established, and the censure and reproach, the hatred and dissension seen among the peoples of former times may not arise anew. So it's really amazing what Baha'u'llah is doing. He's stating that this diversity of opinion, which goes all the way down to like very fundamental things, this diversity of opinion is going to remain an enduring feature of the human condition. And Baha'u'llah gives us the solution to that. It's not a problem that's going to be solved by the correct dogma that everyone will agree on. It's a problem that's going to be solved by tolerance, kindness, forgiving what we consider to be shortcomings in others. And this is where Baha'u'llah in Gems of Divine Mysteries goes a little bit farther, and he says, you know, people in one valley look at the people in the other valley as blasphemers. And the people in that valley see the people in the other valley as just unbelievers or atheists. He says, but both of them are true, and both of them are correct within their own perspective. And so there's this natural tendency to other people who don't think the same way we do. And Baha'u'llah is giving us a very pragmatic but very profound solution to that. And the solution is to recognize that it's a feature of the human condition that we encounter the divine in different ways. And the solution is understanding that, to just overlook and be kind and be tolerant and just get along. It's a very different kind of religiosity. You know, the religiosities of the past have been about, here is the true faith, here is the true doctrine, which the righteous will spread around the world, and everyone is going to, in the case of Islam, be forced by the sword to accept this true doctrine, or in the case of other religions, and Christianity has used the sword as well. I don't want to single out Islam, but religions have used the sword at various times, and other times other forms of coercion. But the idea is that there's some, you know, master doctrine, you know, there's some true dogma that if only everyone would believe the same thing, then God's purpose will be realized in the world. And it doesn't sound like this is what Baha'u'llah is saying his faith is about. It doesn't sound like he's saying unity through uniformity. It sounds like he's saying unity in diversity, which is a very different thing. And it's never been achieved before in human history, by the way, in a way that hasn't ultimately led to its own dissolution. So to say it is not to say it's easy, but there it is.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm just going to go ahead and ask. My question is about still understanding God when it comes to like practical purposes. Like I understand like from the Baha'u'llah's writing is like a lot of these conversations about understanding the nature of God and stuff. I think in the end, what matters most feel like is what are the consequences like to the in our world and stuff. But for me, something as simple as saying prayers, like who am I saying prayers to? Like, does God intervene? Like, I cannot stop thinking about Bob's writing when I say prayers, when he says, like, if you're thinking like of God as the object of your prayer, and like, you know, like, and you were the worshiper, like you were
Yeah,
you're
we're gonna
being
hard to talk about that.
partner with God and stuff. So
Yeah.
I can't stop thinking about that. And like, can we like come to a point where we can, like, for me, like saying prayers, I find it challenging in some ways, is that how can we like understand like in God's intervention or God's purpose, you know?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we might spend a whole we could spend a whole like session just on prayer and like how does prayer make sense if God is if the idea of God as an interventionist God is maybe not the final word in God's reality, you know, and that's where I think we have to recognize, first of all, that different people will continue to have different ideas about prayer. And so the purpose isn't to say, well, this idea about prayer is right and this idea about prayer is wrong, but maybe to introduce a different way of thinking about prayer in which it's not asking for an intervention, but rather it is a process of opening one's perception to inner alignment with the forces of the universe, you know, with that flow of love which is running through all things. And if one sees the act of prayer not as petitioning an external agency for an intervention, but rather the prayer is for me to open up the doors of perception so that I now move fully in line with the currents of the cosmos, which are going to end, you know, which are then going to magnify and multiply my action in the world in a way that's going to bring about great effects. That's another way of thinking about what prayer is and how it works. And in one of them, it's, you know, it's thinking about God as an external agency, and the other, it's more thinking about God as immanent, I suppose. It's something which is within all things that we tap into, like one taps into an electrical current. And then, of course, once you're tapped into that current, you can do amazing things with that electricity.
Thank you.
Hey, Stephen. First of all, thank you so much. And great questions, everyone. And it just makes me think of, I have a question, but it also makes me think of this quote by Rumi: there are hundreds of ways to kiss the ground. So about all these different ways that we have, you know, fragmented views of reality, but how they're all one.
Yeah.
And then the question I have is, you mentioned some answered questions was for the Western mind, and then you mentioned a book for the Eastern mind. What is it, and is it available in English?
Unfortunately, it hasn't been translated. It's a very, very big book by Mirza Abu Faz, and it's called Al-Fara'id, and it hasn't been translated yet. But Abdul Baha said that book is for the ulama. He said, for the Farangi, he said, for the Westerners, for the Europeans, he said, you have Mufawazat, you have some answer questions. He said, for the ulama, he said, you have a Fara'id. Anyway, that's from a Pilgrim Note, but it was from the father of Sohail Bushri, recalled Abdul Baha saying that in 1919. Actually, it's I should reference it. This is in Ashkan Monfared published this not that many years ago. And it's this huge book of all of these recollections of Badi Bushri. So it's just filled with these statements by Abdul Baha. And the one I just referenced is on page, it's on page 247 of that book, for those who have the Persian.
Okay, I think it's me. So going back to the first question that was asked, you spent some time talking about how, you know, so maybe this religiosity that Baha'u'llah is talking about is different to what's come before, right? So this unity and diversity versus the unity and uniformity. And I guess I'm just wondering, could you speak a little bit to how that coexists with, still, right, we're told that, you know, if someone were to hear or come in contact with Baha'u'llah's revelation and not accept Baha'u'llah as the manifestation of God for today, then like there is a difference, right, in that lack of recognition also. So there seems to, and maybe I'm taking things out of context, but there still seems to be like certain hurdles that provide almost barriers to like, and it's probably because I'm not thinking of it right, because I see how the differing perspectives make sense, but I'm just, there seems to still be an importance to that final acceptance to, you still have to accept the manifestation of God for today.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So in the Kitab Aqdas, paragraph 1, where Baha'u'llah says this duty of recognition of him who is the daybringer of his revelation, the fountain of his laws, who represented the Godhead in both the kingdom of his cause and the world creation, Baha'u'llah says the twin duties of recognition and obedience, he said, are inseparable, and neither is acceptable without the other. Does that mean, as Baha'is, we believe that it's just unacceptable not to recognize Baha'u'llah on this day? You know, does that sort of cast you out of the presence of God in some fundamental sense? My take on that is that when Baha'u'llah says, when Baha'u'llah prescribes the duty of recognition, the way I understand it is, I believe that one can recognize the real essence of the Baha'i faith as it is manifested in the world in a number of different ways, not solely through the person of Baha'u'llah. But I understand Baha'u'llah's cause as being an expression of the maturation of the human race, and it's everywhere now. I mean, and we see institutions of civil society, we see and technologies and everything moving in a way that's aligning with these principles of the Baha'i faith, without apparently the Baha'is themselves having anything to do with it. It's as though there's a spirit of the age which is coursing through all things. And some people recognize that and are in tune with it without knowing, as we believe, the source from which it sprang, not knowing the name. And it seems to me that there are so many people in the world, millions of people in the world, who are very much attuned with this spirit of the age, to the extent that you could say they're Baha'is, but they just haven't heard the name Baha'i yet. And I think Abdu'l-Baha said something very similar. You know, when asked to kind of make that division, Abdu'l-Baha said something like, there are many people who carry the name Baha'i who are not Baha'is because they don't carry the spirit of the cause. And conversely, there are many people who have never heard of the name Baha'i who are truly Baha'is because they are embodying this spirit of the age. So that's how I understand that statement of Baha'u'llah in the Kitab Aqdas, which could be read in a very exclusivist way. It could read in a way that if you go down that path, it makes us sound no different from, you know, a lot of my Christian friends who would say, well, Jesus is the way and the truth and the life, and that's it. And you either believe in him or you're damned. And how can I not believe that, but believe that in regard to my own religion? Why would I reject it? What seems so manifestly unjust on the part of a God to inflict, you know, such punishment among his creatures for not recognizing him when they may never have had the chance to have heard that name. So why should it be set up as a sort of prerequisite for attaining nearness? It seems to me, conversely, that it's really about recognizing that spirit, and the spirit is everywhere in this day. Now, having said that, the Baha'is have the spiritual technology to bring humanity to the next stage of its evolution. And so if one doesn't have that, you can say that one lacks certain practical tools that can help humanity to the next level of its evolution. That doesn't mean that one wouldn't individually still have access to the powerful tools of the past. In other words, individuals who say, well, I have I get everything I need spiritually from the Buddhist writings or from the New Testament. Do we say even in our hearts that such a person is somehow distant from God because they haven't read the hidden words and said, yeah, I recognize the truth in that as well? If they're living their lives as Baha'is do, with the sense of concern for their neighbor, with a sense of orientation towards an ultimate spiritual reality, isn't that what the true Baha'i faith is? I'll also bring into the mix a statement the House of Justice made a few years ago in One Common Faith, where it talked about the difference between the Baha'i faith and other religions, as Baha'u'llah, and this is a pretty close paraphrase, if not a quotation. It said, Baha'u'llah did not come to bring one more religion to stand alongside the existing multiplicity of sectarian organizations. Rather, has he recast the very conception of religion as the principal force impelling the development of consciousness. It's like such a different way of thinking about what the Baha'i faith is. It's not like one more religious organization, which is now in some way fundamentally in competition with the other churches and the other religions, in competition for members, ultimately, who says they're part of this congregation. And the House says Baha'u'llah didn't come to do that. He didn't come to set up one more competing religious congregation. Rather, has he recast the very conception of religion as the principal force impelling the development of consciousness. It's a far more boundaryless conception, I think, of what religion is than I'm a card-carrying member of this community and therefore I have a certain special relationship with God.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's super helpful.
This is a question I've been holding on to. That's kind of impertinent to today's topic. For your service, you ended up learning Farsi and Arabic. And my question is that I've gotten an adequate answer from someone else, but I think that you would be an expert on this. Is it worth it for us to try and spend time to learn either Farsi or Arabic to better understand the writings in their original language? Or is it better for us to just spend our time in English studying the writings and kind of understand the writings from that perspective?
Oh, great question. It totally depends on you and whether you're like natural. If you're like naturally good with languages, then I would really highly recommend it, because a little bit of Arabic and Persian goes a long way. You understand the Baha'i months now. It's like they're not just words that you've memorized. You can memorize, say, the short obligatory prayer, and which is just a few words long, and you understand every word of it. And it really pays dividends, I think. Even learning a little bit of Arabic and Persian. But if foreign languages aren't your thing, and different people are just wired differently. So for some people, it's just hell to learn another language, especially one that has a different writing system. There's that additional difficulty, and that's just like a huge mountain to climb for some people. And so I would say it depends on whether you're just handy with languages or not. And if you are, I'd say definitely go for it and take it a little ways, and you'll see how it pays back.
Awesome. Thank you. Do you chant now that you know Arabic and Farsi, or do you not chant?
Yeah, I mean, I never learned to chant like properly, say a Persian would, but I've memorized some chants, and I've memorized some of my favorite surahs from the Quran, and like can chant them in like an Arabic style, just according to how I've memorized it from a cassette tape, and a few other things. So yeah, that's another way it pays dividends, is like you can chant a little bit. It for some of us, because of our voices, in the privacy of our own chamber. So we're like way past time now. It's so our hour is well past, so we should probably wrap it up for the week, and see you again in a couple weeks.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks so much for coming. See you next time.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks,
you.
everyone.